Hello and welcome to another video from me, Rough Swordsman, Wargamer. It's an open the box and it's an unboxing of a brand new game from a company from Serbia. And the game in question is Freezing Inferno, USSR V Finland, 1939 to 1940. And it's published by Princeps Games. And I have to thank everyone from Princeps for sending me this review copy. Thank you very much. Here's the other side. Not much info, except it says Freezing Inferno is a medium level war game covering one of the conflicts at the beginning of World War II between the USSR and Finland, also known as the Winter War of 39-40. So a nice view of what's in the box. And we have ages 14 plus, 1 to 2 players, playing time 4 to 6 hours. It's heavy, so it looks like there's lots of stuff in the box, and it's 4 inches thick. Right, let's get the shrink wrap off. The shrink wrap is off, and it's a handsome looking piece of box art there. So let's open the box. First thing we see is the mounted map board. So we'll have a look at that in a moment. The thing I want to look at first is here. It's the rules. Let's see what this is all about. Here's the rule book. It's actually 46 pages, but the standard rules is only about 22 pages, I believe. As you can see, small but full colour glossy paper. Got the contents. And then we're into the introduction, what's in the game box, how to win the game. So in a 2-player game, one controls Finland, the other controls the USSR, and to win, the Soviets must occupy 2 of the 3 Finnish key cities, which we'll see on the map, and they're marked with an asterisk, and hold on to them. And the Finns basically have to stop them doing that. They're defending, of course. It's 8 rounds. Within those rounds, the USSR and Finland have their own turn. A bit about the game board, which we'll have a look at. Borders and these cities, some of which are key. We then have this terrain modifier, how that all works. And like most war games, we've got terrain attack modifiers depending on who's attacking who. And certain terrain gives advantages to the attacking or defending unit. An explanation of the types of units in the game and their characteristics, their attack values, their defense values, which we'll have a look at, and their movement points. And things like artillery and anti-aircraft have a hex range, and fighters and bombers have a movement in hex ranges as well. Artillery can only attack units on the ground, which makes sense, but they can attack air units if they've landed at airfields. And of course, anti-aircraft can only attack air units while they're in the air. HQs, of course, cannot attack, they can only defend. It says here, each unit has its own strength except anti-aircraft and HQs. And the unit's strength is shown by how many of those units are stacked together. There's a maximum stacking of 5 counters, and it says here the anti-aircraft and HQ have no strength, therefore they can't have more than 1 counter in a hex. Then it tells you how to work out the total attack and defense value, which is pretty easy to understand. You add how many units there are in the stack, that's its strength, and add the attack value, which will be the same, so you add 1 of those. And for the defensive value, exactly the same thing. The strength value, i.e. the stack number, and its defense value is added onto it. So as it says here, infantry have an attack value of 2. There are 4 in a stack, so that 4 plus the 2 gives you 6 total attack value. And as I say, the same thing is done with the defense value. This, I'm not sure what's going on here. This may well have been a Kickstarter add-on or stretch goal using miniatures. Regrouping is allowed. You can use a unit's movement allowance to move across some of those units to reinforce another stack of units. And here's some rules for that. A unit strength cannot be higher than 5. You can't stack more than 5 in a hex. Can't be less than 2. One unit can be divided into 2 units. And as with most hex and counter games, it's up to you who you move, how far you move them, and whether or not you want to engage in combat. So an explanation of what is a ground unit and an air unit. Zones of control. These appear to be sticky when you move into them, but you can move out at the start of the next turn. So when you move into a Zoc, an enemy Zoc, you can't move anywhere else. You're stuck there. You can only attack. That explains that. Supply. To be in supply, units must be 7 or less hexes away from its HQ, and of course you can't trace those 7 hexes through enemy Zocs or impassable hexes or unfrozen lakes, and that depends on the weather. Consequences of being out of supply. And then occupying a city. It can only be occupied by ground troops. That excludes anti-aircraft and HQs. And when a ground unit occupies this city, we adjust something called the NMCC, which we'll look at in a moment. That's their buying power of reinforcements or bolstering damaged units, and we'll see, as I say, how that works in a moment. When you leave an opponent's occupied city, it is still under that side's control, and we put a little flag on that hex. Capturing an airport, you have to take control of the control tower hex. Air bridge, airlifts in other words. You can transfer infantry and headquarters from airports to airports, because when you use an air unit, it takes off from an airport and has to land back at an airport, and during that they can move infantry, and this explains how that works. The initial game setup. So at the beginning, each side arranges its units using the mini-map, which you get a nice load of. So each side gets one of those to mark down where their units are. If you don't want to do that, it says here you can do it by drafting, where you place one unit at a time in turn, and the Soviet player goes first. So that's an option. Some hints for first-time players about placing your units. And there are 2 ways to start the game: the basic version, advanced version. Here you can see that all units will have a strength of 5, and there'll be 9 units in total that will have that strength, 3 for artillery, and so on. If you're a bit uncertain of how to place your troops, because this is your first playthrough, at the back of this book are some maps which will give you a predetermined setup, so you can get on with your first game straight away. The advanced version of setup means you have points, and you can distribute those points as you wish within certain criteria. Combat, the battle. The attacked unit is where the battle takes place, so that unit's terrain is taken into account. Types of battles are ground to ground, air to ground, air to air, and operation of air defense. Then goes in to explain the different types of battles and how to resolve the battles, which are pretty easy. You work out total attack value and the total defense value and put those in a ratio, attack to defense, and then you look up that result on one of the player aids, or player cards, should I say, as you'll see in a moment, and that will tell you the result. And it's done by the quite common attacker result first / defender result, as you can see here. Strength that falls below 1 means that unit is eliminated and removed from the board. And during the reinforcement replenishment phases, you can bring those back on at a cost. And here are the results that can occur, how to retreat, and adjusting luck. Now in the game, as you'll see, there are a few dice. When doing battles, you use the D8, and as it says here, you have a 12.5% chance to get any number. But there are also D20s with the numbers 1 to 8. So you get a better chance of getting 3, 4, 5, and 6, and a slightly lower chance of getting a 1, 2, 7, or 8. This means you have sort of less chance to completely fail or perform brilliantly, so it sort of evens out the sort of impact of battles. And that's up to you if you wish to do that. Special player abilities. The Finns are able to capture Soviet tanks. So if they actually get a result that would destroy the Soviet tank, they can take it over. And that tells you how they can do that. And the Soviets have the ability to remove the tracks from their tanks to enable them to move up to 20 movement points. However, there is a danger of them getting out of command, and the penalties for that are quite severe. And the tracks, if they wish, can be put on at the start of their next turn. Calendar. Each game round represents one time period, it says. For each time period, there are 3 cards, and we'll look at those in a minute, which describe important historical events. So you randomly choose one of those 3 for each of those 8 sort of phases of the game. And at the start of each of those phases, you will turn up that card, and that will influence what happens during that phase. So that gives it a little bit of randomness and helps with the replayability as well. So as I mentioned earlier, you can get reinforcements or replenish old units, and you buy those, and the cost of those is given here. Now it says price without module, with module 1, 3, and 2 and 3, and we'll see those. These are sort of clip-on extras, optional rules that you can use. You don't have to use them, but some of them are quite interesting, and we'll have a look at those. If you wish to bring on a new unit with a maximum strength of 5, you can do that, but you will have to pay a formation fee of 2 military capacity, which, as I explained earlier, is like your money to buy units. This tells you when and how they are placed on the map. And that's it. That's the sort of standard rules, if you like. Now we have these modules that I mentioned earlier. You don't have to use them, but they do look interesting. We've got module 1, which is the weather. And if you're using this module, you start the game with the temperature set to very cold. So you get frozen lakes, and infantry can cross those lakes and clear. So no effect. But at the beginning of the next round, you will roll a 10-sided die for the temperature and a 12-sided die for the weather conditions. And as you can see, it will affect what goes on during that round. Next module is the technological tactical improvement module. And there are 4 branches of research: meteorological, espionage, sabotage, and technological advancements. And you pay military capacity, money, and upgrade them. And when you reach a certain level, field 3, you can activate that advantage. You have to roll a d8, and if you get the number required, you get that advantage. If you don't, you have to start again. The marker is reset. So a little bit about these advantages and advancements and the specific technological advancements for Finland and the USSR. Module 3, Diplomacy. So a lot going on with this game that you can sort of clip on to the standard game, and it's entirely up to you whether or not you use them. Here is the sort of action sequence, the sequence of play, if you like, for when you set up and start the game, what happens in round 1 of 8, and for the rest of the rounds. Wish this was on a bigger card. It's quite small. Those with less than perfect eyesight might have to squint a bit, but what I'll do is print this out and make it a little bit bigger. And then a bit about the solo mode. During the prototype version of this wasn't around. I think they put this on because of feedback. And although it says AI bot here, there isn't anything that controls it. It's basically given you ideas of how you're going to control either the Finns or the Soviets as the other player. So as long as you follow that, it should be a pretty balanced game. It does take into account the modules, so you can actually use the modules when playing solo, and it tells you again how to sort of use those. So here's the Finnish bot and how to use the modules for that side, the USSR bot, and how to use the modules when you're playing against them. Then we've got these setup maps, which are used for solo playthrough. But I don't know if you remember earlier, if it's your first game, you're not sure how to set them up. The ones labeled B give you a setup for your first few playthroughs if you're playing against an opponent. And there's one, if I can find it, for the Soviet setup. I know it says bot setup, but you can use this to set up your first couple of games. Otherwise, there are 8 of these maps for solo play, and you roll a die depending on whether or not you're playing against the Finns or playing against the Soviets. So you throw a die and pick the one the die lands on. What I might do though is roll for both sides, so each side is completely randomized, and that gives replayability. You're not setting up your own troops in the same way every time. So there we are. And for the Soviets, that is it. With the credits at the back. Them's the rules. Mentioned these earlier. These are like the setup maps. So you and the other player can sort of put where you're placing your units. And then once you've both done that, you can place them. It's to stop any nefarious placing of units once you see what your opponent's doing. But there was a goodly amount of those. And then next we've got in a bag the counters. So let's have a look at those. So there are 5 sheets of counters, and each one is identical. So we'll have a look at one of them, and they're the same on both sides. Very simple counters. We've got the attack value and defense value there, and its movement, hexes in the case of the planes, movement points in the case of ground units. And as the maximum stacking limit is 5, we've got 5 of each. And there are 5 lots of those to put on the map. So say here the aircraft is the fighters, here are the bombers, the same for the Finns, infantry of course, anti-aircraft. These are the HQs, I believe, the generals controlling the battle, with these used for the modules and some admin counters here. Very nice, pre-rounded, punch out very easily. Nice thickness as well. So that's the counters. Then we've got the mounted map board in a protective bubble wrap sleeve. So let's have a look at that. Right, here's the mounted map board. And it's one of those that run up and down rather than left to right, which is why everything's on its side here. We can see bits of Norway here, Sweden, but of course, two main protagonists, USSR and Finland. The red lines here are the borders, and we can see lots of snow and ice, and it is back printed as well, and there's a slightly different version on the other side, which some people may prefer. But we'll take a look at this one first. We can see lots of clear terrain with forests and lakes. And if the weather is bad enough, these will be frozen over and can be crossed. We'll have a zoom in a moment to have a better look, but overall we've got towns which have a number by them. And this is the amount of military capacity or money or points to buy troops are worth for the occupying side. And I'm not sure until we zoom in if you can see, but in Finland we've got 3 with these stars. And these are the Soviets' main objective. We've got Petsamo there, Helsinki down here, and Oulu, hope I'm pronouncing that right, there. If the Finns can get into the USSR, you can see a lot of their cities are worth quite a few points. Here are the airfields. It's got a runway and a control tower, and the control tower of an airport is the one the other side has to control to completely control that airport. Over here we've got fortifications, and along the edges of the board, we can just see them, we'll have a close-up in a minute, are tracks and tables. And there's one over here as well. Right, let's have a close-up. So down here, which would be if the map was running top to bottom, at the bottom left-hand edge, or as our map was displayed on the bottom right, we've got this diplomacy track, one of those modules that we showed you earlier. Here's a city with how much military capacity it's worth. And here's Helsinki, one of those that the USSR have to capture. And here's a close-up of one of the airports. Just over a bit to the right, you can see some fortifications. And here's another close-up, this time showing not only the forests, but the hills and the mountains. Down at the bottom of the map, as we saw it, or on the left-hand side if you've got it going up and down, is this track, which will keep a note of your military capacity for each side. And the rules call this the National Military Capacity Chart. And of course we'll move up and down when cities are occupied. And to start with, you can see the 2 national emblems there. The Finns start with 28 points of military capacity and the USSR 29. And I assume you can also use this to keep track of the rounds. And next to the military capacity track, we've got the attack modifiers. As I mentioned earlier, there is another version of this map on the other side, so let's have a quick look at that. So here we are. This is the other side of the map, a completely different sort of color palette. and a more, I don't know, I suppose, matter-of-fact version of the map. But of course, it's still got all the tables that the other side has. We've got the national military capacity chart here, the attack modifier just up in the corner here, and the diplomacy one down the bottom. We'll have a close-up here because it does look very different to the other side. Here we've got a more symbolic representation of the airports. Here we've got the lakes and the cities with their values on them, and the forests are a bit more subdued than on the other side. So you have a choice as to which side of the map you wish to play on. But there we go, that's the map. Now the last thing in the box, and the reason it's that deep, is because it has storage boxes in the bottom of it. And here's an example of one. So what are these for? Well, these two, I assume, which are empty at the moment, one for the USSR and one for the Finns, is to keep the counters in. This one here has got, if you like, money tokens in it, which you'll keep track of how many military capacity points you've got to spend, because you don't have to spend them all. You can save them for the next round. That allows you to rebuy and replenish your troops. So that gives you a record of how much you've got to spend. In this one here, we have the dice. Let's have a look at those first. We've got a normal 8-sided die. I think this is the normal 12-sider. A D10. And these D20s, I think these are, that have been modified to only go up to 8 to sort of even out the odds when you're rolling for the results of combat. So they're optional. You can either use the normal 8-sider or those modified D20s. Also in here are the cards we mentioned earlier. Let's get these out. And as you can see, they're numbered 1 to 8. And there are 3 of them in every set. And you shuffle each 3, pick one, and this is turned up at the start of that round. So that's the cards and the dice. And then in here, we've got the player aids. So let's have a look at those. These player aids are on thick card. So here's the first one. This is the air to ground combat results table. And I think this will make it easy to use, because I believe, unlike most ratios, you don't have to simplify them down to look them up on the combat results table. You use them as is. And on the other side, we've got the ground to ground and air to air combat result table. Next, we've got the single-sided player aid chart, which puts together the temperature and weather conditions that you roll for at the start of every round if you're using Module 1. There are 2 copies of this player aid summarising technological, tactical improvements you can get using Module 2. This is single-sided and they're identical. One for the USSR and one for the Finns. And then a summary of the action sequence and unit cost taken from the rulebook, which is great. And a minor thing, as I mentioned earlier, for my eyes, maybe the font is a little bit small, but that's just me. You may find it perfectly adequate, but it's great to see on a separate player aid. And on the other side, we've got the combat results table abbreviations and what they mean, and a terrain movement modifier key at the bottom. Very helpful. And if you're going to play solo, here's a player aid summarising how the bots work and how you should play them. One for USSR, and of course on the other side, the Finland AI bot. And that's it. That's everything in the box. So this has been an Open the Box, an unboxing of a brand new game from Princeps Games. Freezing Inferno. Quite a different looking game with some interesting mechanics that, if you're interested in what you've seen, you'll want to explore. But I hope you enjoyed that. If you did and you haven't done so already, why not be a good egg and have a think about subscribing to the channel? Really does help. Pushing the like button, the thumbs up underneath the video helps as well. And if you want to be informed of other content the channel uploads, then push that bell. But make sure you push all notifications. Leave a comment. This game has had a little bit of exposure in its early days when some YouTubers were doing a look at this game in its prototype version. Some of those YouTubers gave Princeps Games some feedback, and these, by the looks of it, have been incorporated into the retail version, which is great. But what do you think? Let me know, because I love to read them. Thanks as always to my subscribers. Thank you so much. And one last thing, if you wish to support the channel a little bit further, well, you can buy the channel a coffee, and there's a link for that in the description, or you can push the super thanks button underneath the video, either of which, if you decide to do that, just helps the channel to keep ticking along. So thank you. Right then, I hope you can join me for the next video, but until then, as always, you take care and goodbye.